Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. You know, we've been doing a lot of videos of the standard classics. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Handel. Sometimes I just get sick of those guys. I got to tell you, I love them. We all love them. But there's so much more out there. And one of the great joys of doing this is finding out what that so much more is. And so today we're going to talk about something completely different. Finnish composer Leevi Madetoja. Yes, a household name. We all know it. Who was Leevi Madetoja? You may well ask. Well, I'm going to tell you. What are his dates here? He lived from 1887 to 1947. He was not that old. He was only 60 when he died. He was a major alcoholic, as so many people from that part of the world seem to be. And, he was always sort of in rough shape financially, like so many people in the music business seem to be. His story was, in a sense, a typical one. He studied with Sibelius for a couple of years. Not that that achieved very much, because Sibelius was not interested in teaching particularly, but Madetoja claimed to have learned quite a bit from Sibelius as a composer, as well as from a human being, although he certainly did not learn how to hold his liquor as well as Sibelius managed to throughout his very, very long and alcohol-saturated life. Never mind. Enough with the, problems with controlled substances and other things. Madetoja was a wonderful, wonderful composer. He is best known for his opera, The Ostrobothnians. If you've ever been to Ostrobothnia, you'll know that the Ostrobothnians is a wonderful description of life in Ostrobothnia. But seriously, the Ostrobothnians was a huge success in the 1920s when it was first performed. It became the Finnish national opera. It still is. It's kind of like Smetana's The Bartered Bride goes to Ostrobothnia, and it's not about a bartered bride, but that's a whole nother issue. And really, he was just a terrific guy. He wrote beautiful, beautiful music, and 3 absolutely first-class symphonies, which are the things we are going to be talking about, because they are generally considered the finest symphonies in the immediate orbit of Sibelius, because they were all composed while Sibelius was still alive and was still actually active. We're going to talk specifically about the Second Symphony, which was written in about 1918, which, as you know, was a very fateful year. It was World War I, and in Finland, it was the Finnish Civil War, the war for independence against Tsarist Russia. So, during which Madetoja's brother was killed. So, the Second Symphony, which is unbelievably beautiful, is an exceptional piece of wartime music and a very, very passionate utterance. But Madetoja was not a romantic in the let it all hang out sort of mode. He was actually somewhat reserved, somewhat restrained, and his music reflects that. Not that it isn't expressive. It's extremely expressive, as you'll hear. I want to play you the opening of that Second Symphony, the Wartime Symphony, which is his biggest, most sort of effusive symphony, and it's just extraordinarily beautiful. Here it is. It's on this performance is on Ondine with John Storgarts and the Helsinki Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, can't you just tell that that's the work of a great symphonist? I mean, what is it? It's the opening minute or so, right? But you can tell immediately that this is going to be a wartime piece. It begins with a pastoral melody, and immediately the mood darkens, and the same rhythm that was so delightful in the flutes becomes ominous and threatening in the strings. I mean, you just, the entire emotional sort of atmosphere of the piece is captured in this opening minute. And if a composer can sustain it, if he can continue in the same vein, you know you're going to have a masterpiece. And he does. That's the point. The man brings home the bacon. He really does. The only issue the Second Symphony has ever had is that, as with the Third Symphony too, they end quietly, which, as you know, is an unpardonable sin when it comes to programming large symphonies, because, unless it's like Mahler's Ninth, which we now understand can end quietly because the ending is like death, they're all supposed to be noisy and triumphant. And these symphonies are not. They have their noisy bits, but triumphant, not so much. They tend to retreat into calm and that sort of quiet, sometimes troubled demeanor that seems to be Madetoja's specialty. Now, the Third Symphony. The Third Symphony. The Third Symphony was composed in 1926. And, it really is quite different from the Second Symphony. Madetoja seems to have followed Sibelius into his own personal version of a more neoclassical cast. But unlike Sibelius, Madetoja was heavily influenced by French music and French culture. Not the impressionist music of Debussy and those guys, but rather the idea of French classicism, the poise, the clearness. It's quite beautiful. I mean, it's very, very funny. Whenever we hear music that's like neat and clean and precise and beautifully reserved, and we always call it French. I mean, I guess, people who do that have never heard like Roussel's Second Symphony. I mean, there's plenty of French music that doesn't sound particularly French. Tournemire symphonies, we'll talk about some of those. Yeah, there's lots of it, but there are these generalizations we make, and one of them is that French culture is neat and clean and sec and perky, and, well, that may or may not be French culture, but it does describe Madetoja's Third Symphony pretty well. It's not an insubstantial work at all. It lasts a good half an hour. It has 4 substantial movements, but it tends to be rather pastoral in character, and its general atmosphere is one of lightness and luminosity, and it's just quite lovely. And the major movement, the biggest movement, the third movement, is a scherzo. And the finale is sort of an open-air, breezy waltz. At least it becomes one before the quiet ending. And so, the piece has this sort of reputation for being French. Call it what you will. I want to play you a little bit of that scherzo. What a splendid, splendid movement this is. I mean, again, you listen to this and you just know that you're listening to a master. I mean, there's no question about it that this guy had the chops. And if he hadn't been drinking so much, he probably would have written more. In fact, he did write more. He wrote a Fourth Symphony, which theoretically got lost when his suitcase or his briefcase was stolen at a Paris railroad station. And so the Fourth Symphony, like Sibelius's Eighth, sort of disappeared. But there's a certain amount of question about how much of it ever existed in the first place. Apparently, by the time that this happened, toward the end of his life, Madetoja was so saturated with alcohol that he couldn't recreate the score if it had ever existed in the first place. But, enough of that. Let's listen to the scherzo of the Third Symphony. I love this piece, and you will too. You absolutely will. Isn't that great? I mean, that's the real stuff. It's wonderful. Now, there have been actually quite a few recordings of these symphonies. I mean, there have been some on Finlandia, and there is a big set of the complete orchestral music, which runs to like 6 or 7 discs on Alba. And Chandos recorded the symphonies with the Iceland Symphony Orchestra, which, by the way, I mean, they're not bad, but I don't recommend them, because if you really want the juicy Gesunte Madetoja, then you have to get these Ondine recordings, which I've been playing you, which my fingers are all over. Here they are. Let me just put them up here. First of all, they have lovely covers, but they are featuring the Helsinki Philharmonic under John Storgard's. I mean, this is really the best of Madetoja, with a major orchestra and beautifully performed and recorded. And really, these discs would grace any collection. And you get more Madetoja. The disc with the second symphony, let's see, has his early tone poem, Kullervo. Now, where do we know Kullervo from? Of course, the difference between this Kullervo and Sibelius's Kullervo is that Sibelius is a major choral symphony lasting 70 minutes, whereas this is a 15-minute long tone poem, which right away sort of tells you the difference between the two composers, and that Madetoja was always erring on the side of brevity, which actually became Sibelius's aesthetic as well, but not at the point he did Kullervo. And you also get his Elegy, Opus 4, number 1. And then finally, on the disc that has the third symphony, which is this fabulous object, you get the first symphony, which is in 3 movements. It's only 21 minutes long, but it's a marvelous, masterful piece with quite a few echoes of Sibelius. If you love Sibelius, you'll really like the first symphony. And the suite from his ballet, O con Fuoco, which is a sort of Japanese-themed ballet that was written for Copenhagen and never got performed in Copenhagen. It apparently had a somewhat complicated libretto that involved talking and singing and acting and dancing, and it's one of those hybrid works. But Madetoja did make a suite, and the complete work was recorded by Alba, and you get to hear it here. It's one of his one of his truly major works. And so there is one other piece I want to tell you about by Madetoja, which I'm not going to play you, but just so you know, after the Ostrobothnians, he wrote another opera called Juha. Now, you need to know about Juha, and the reason is because there is another Juha. The libretto was by the soprano Aino Akte, for whom Sibelius wrote Luanotar. I mean, it was a small world, and all these people knew each other and were sort of working together. And originally she had the libretto set by a different Finnish composer, Are Merikanto. Now, Merikanto was a modernist, unlike Madetoja, and his music was fairly widely ignored in his lifetime, and his version of Juha was considered too modernist at the time that it was written, which was all the same time here, around 1920-ish. And it's actually a very beautiful score with influences of like Puccini. That was considered modernist in Finland at the day. So as history has evolved, it is Merikanto's Juha that has gotten all the acclaim as opposed to Madetoja's Juha. And so there is this sort of dueling Juha controversy in Finnish music. Ondine has recorded both operas, so you too can have dueling Juhas in your record collection if that's the kind of thing that appeals to you. They are both lovely, lovely operas, and the stylistics are quite different, even though the librettos are virtually identical. It's really kind of interesting, and when you're discovering, the glory that is 20th century Finnish music, which is just marvelous, of course, you're going to wind up with a couple of Juhas. And so, not to be confused with Yoo-hoo, we're talking Juha. And so I'm just letting you know that there are 2 of them, and by 2 different composers, both of whose last names begin with the letter M, Merikanto and Madetoja, which is like, could it possibly be more confusing than that? Yes, there could be 3 Juhas. Be happy, there are only 2 of them that we need to worry about. But that was the other major work in Madetoja's career, and he really was a very fine opera composer. He had a keen dramatic sense, a good feeling for color and atmosphere, and they're beautiful works. If you're an opera guy, at some point maybe I'll talk about them, because the two operas really deserve to be promoted, as does Mericanto's Yuha, which is gorgeous. So, to conclude, you really, really need to get the Symphonies 2 and 3 minimally of Leevi Madetoja on Ondine with the Helsinki Philharmonic under John Storgårds. They are glorious performances of two truly, truly great 20th century symphonies. I'm not kidding. They're as good as Sibelius's. They are really great works, and they deserve as much attention as we can possibly give them, at least in our own record collections at home, because I suspect we will be waiting a very, very long time for concert performances of these works, unless, of course, you happen to live in Finland. So enjoy Madetoja and keep on listening. Thank you. Take care.